I see Eric. Okay, Eric is here. Just waiting for Steven. I'm ping him just in case. Give it a minute. Louie, are you coming? There he is. Louie, you beat Steven here. Alright. Everybody's here. So where we left off, he was about to take that test. We left off on quite the cliffhanger. Alright, so we're on chapter 123. The Spinning Leaf. Okay. The next morning, Vachette came to collect me just as I was finishing my breakfast. Don't start. Come, she said. Carceret has been praying for a storm all night, but it's only gusting. I didn't know what that meant, but I didn't feel like asking either. I returned my wooden plate and turned around to find Penth standing there, a slight yellowing bruise along her jawline. Penth didn't say anything, merely gripped my arms in an open show of support. Then she hugged me tightly. I was surprised when her head only came up to my chest. I'd forgotten how small she was. The dining room was even more quiet than normal, and while no one was staring, everyone was watching. Vachette walked me to the tiny park where we had first met and began our usual limbering stretch. The routine of it relaxed me, lulling my anxiety to a dull rumble. When we were finished, Vachette led me down into the hidden valley of the sword tree. I wasn't surprised. Where else would the test take place? There were a dozen people scattered in the open field around the tree. Most of them were dressed in mercenary reds, but I saw 3 wearing lighter clothes. I guessed they were important members of the community, or perhaps retired mercenaries still involved with the school. Vachette pointed toward the tree. At first I thought she was drawing my attention to the motion of it. It was, as she had said, a rather blustery day, and the branches lashed wildly at the empty air. Then I saw a glint of metal against its trunk. Looking more closely, I could see a sword there, tied to the trunk of the tree. I thought of Celian dancing among the sharp leaves to slap the trunk of the tree, of course. There are several items around the base of the tree, Vachette said. Your test is to go in, choose one, and bring it out again. This is the test? I demanded. It came out a little sharper than I'd planned. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you ask? She countered dryly, then laid her hand gently on my arm. I would have, she said, eventually. But I knew if I told you too soon, you would try your hand at it. You would try your hand at it and hurt yourself. Well, thank God we saved that for today, I said, then sighed, resigned apology. What happens if I go in there and get cut to ribbons? Getting cut is usually a given, she said, and pulled aside the neck of her shirt, revealing a pair of familiar pale, thin scars on her shoulder. The question is how much and where and how you behave. She shrugged her shirt back into place. The leaves will not cut deep, but be careful of your face and neck. The place where vessels and tendons are close to the surface. A cut on your chest or arm can be mended easily, less so a severed ear. I watched the tree as it caught a gust of wind, branches flailing madly. What keeps a person from crawling there on hands and knees? Pride, she said, her eyes searching my face. Will you be known as the one who crawled during this test? I nodded. This was an issue for me especially. As a barbarian, I had twice as much to prove. I looked at the tree again. It was 30 feet from the edge of the lashing branches to the trunk. I thought back to the scars I'd seen on Tempe's body, on Carceret's face. So this is a test of nerve, I said. A test of pride. It is a test of many things, Vachette said. Your behavior signifies a great deal. You could throw your arms over your face and rush ahead. The straightest line is quickest, after all. But what does that reveal of you? Are you a bull that charges blindly? Are you an animal without any subtlety or grace? She shook her head, frowning. I expect better from a student of mine. I squinted my eyes, trying to see what other items were gathered around the tree. I suppose I'm not allowed to ask what the proper choice is. There are many proper choices, and many more improper ones. It is different for everyone. The item you bring back reveals much. What you do with the item afterwards reveals much. How you comport yourself reveals much. She shrugged. All these things Shane will consider before deciding if you are to be admitted into the school. If Shane is the one to decide, why are all these others here? Bichette forced a smile, and I saw anxiety lurking deep in her eyes. Shane does not embody the entire school herself. She gestured to the distant Adem standing around the sword tree. Less does she represent the entirety of the path of the Latantha. I keep wanting to say Lethani every time that word comes up. This is still better than a job interview. Yeah. Those can be really, really rough too. I looked around and realized the handful of non-red shirts were not light, but white. These were the heads of other schools. They had traveled here to see the barbarian take his test. Is this usual? I asked. Bichette shook her head. I could feign ignorance, but I suspect Carceret spread word. Can they overrule Shane's decision? I asked. Bichette shook her head. No, it is her school, her decision. No one would dispute her right to make it. At her side, her hand flickered. However. Very well, I said. Bichette reached out and gripped my hand in both of hers, squeezed it, then let it fall. I walked to the sword tree. For a moment the wind ceased. The wind eased, and the thick canopy of hanging branches reminded me of the tree where I had met the Cathay. It was not a comforting thought. I watched the spinning leaves, trying not to think of how sharp they were, how they would slice into the meat of me, how they could glide through the thin skin of my hands and slice through the delicate tendons underneath. From the edge of the canopy into the safety of the trunk couldn't be more than 30 feet, in some ways not very far at all. I thought of Celian darting wildly through the leaves. I thought of her jumping and swatting branches away. If she could do it, then certainly so could I. But even as I thought it, I knew it simply wasn't true. Celian had played here all her life. She was skinny as a twig, quick as a cricket, and half my size. Compared to her, I was a lumbering bear. I saw a handful of Adem mercenaries on the far side of the tree. Two of the more intimidating white shirts were there as well. I could feel their eyes on me, and in a strange way I was glad. When you're alone, it's easy to be afraid. It's easy to focus on what might be lurking in the dark at the bottom of the cellar steps. It's easy to obsess on unproductive things, like the madness of stepping into a storm of spinning knives. When you're alone, it's easy to sweat, panic, fall apart. But I wasn't alone. And it wasn't just Bichette and Shane watching me. There were a dozen mercenaries and the heads of other schools besides. I had an audience. I was on stage, and there's nowhere in the world I am more comfortable than on a stage. I waited just outside the reach of the longest branches, watching for a break in their motion. I hoped their random spinning would, just for a moment, open into a path I could dart through, striking away any leaves that came too close. I could use fan water to keep them away from my face. I stood at the edge of the canopy and watched, waiting for an opening, trying to anticipate the pattern. The motion of the tree lulled me like it had so many times before. It was beautiful, all circles and arcs. As I watched, gently dazed by the motion of the tree, I felt my mind slip lightly into the clear, empty float of spinning leaf. I realized the motion of the tree wasn't random at all, really. It was actually a pattern made of endless changing patterns. And then, my mind open and empty, I saw the wind spread out before me. It was like frost forming on a blank sheet of window glass. One moment, nothing. The next, I could see the name of the wind as clearly as the back of my own hand. I looked around for a moment, marveling in it. I tasted the shape of it on my tongue and knew if I desired, I could stir it into a storm. I could hush it to a whisper, leaving the sword tree hanging empty and still. But that seemed wrong. Instead, I simply opened my eyes wide to the wind, watching where it would choose to push the branches, watching where it would flick the leaves. Then I stepped under the canopy, calmly as you would walk through your own front door. I took 2 steps, then stopped as a pair of leaves sliced through the air in front of me. I stepped sideways and forward as the wind spun another branch through the space behind me. I moved through the dancing branches of the sword tree, not running, not frantically batting them away with my hands. I stepped carefully, deliberately. It was, I realized, the way Shane moved when she fought. Not quickly, though sometimes she was quick. She moved perfectly, always where she needed to be. I should have said that, yeah. I thought it, but I didn't say it. Almost before I realized it, I was standing on the dark earth that circled the wide trunk of the sword tree. The spinning leaves could not reach here. Safe for the moment, I relaxed and focused on what was waiting there for me. The sword I had seen from the edge of the clearing was bound to the tree with a white silk cord that ran around the trunk. The sword was half drawn from its sheath, and I could see the blade was similar to Vichette's sword. The metal was an odd burnished gray without mark or blemish. Thank you. Next to the tree, on a small table, sat a familiar red shirt, folded neatly in half. There was an arrow with stark white fletching and a polished wooden cylinder of the sort that would hold a scroll. A bright glitter caught my eye, and I turned to see a thick gold bar nestled in the dark earth among the roots of the tree. Was it truly gold? I bent and touched it. It was chill under my fingers, and was too heavy for my single hand to pry up from the ground. How much did it weigh? 40 pounds? 50? Enough gold for me to stay at the university forever, no matter how viciously they raised my tuition. I slowly made my way around the trunk of the sword tree and saw a fluttering piece of silk hanging from a low branch. There was another sword of a more ordinary sort hanging from the same white cord. There were 3 blue flowers tied with a blue ribbon. There was a tarnished vintage halfpenny. There was a long, flat whetstone, dark with oil. Then I came to the other side of the tree and saw my lute case leaning casually against the trunk. Seeing it there, knowing someone had gone into my room and taken it from under my bed, filled me with a sudden, terrible rage. It was all the worse knowing what the Adem thought of musicians. It meant they knew I wasn't merely a barbarian, but a cheap and tawdry whore as well. It had been left there to taunt me. I had called the name of the wind in the grip of a terrible anger before, in Imra after Ambrose had broken my lute, and I had called it in terror and fury to defend myself against Felurian, but this time the knowledge of it hadn't come to me borne on the back of some strong emotion. It had slipped into it gently, the way you must reach out to catch a gently floating thistle seed. So when I saw my lute, the welter of hot emotion brought me crashing out of spinning leaf like a sparrow struck with a stone. The name of the wind tattered to shreds, leaving me empty and blind. Looking around at the madly dancing leaves, I could see no pattern at all, only 1,000 wind-blown razors slicing at the air. I finished my slow circuit of the tree with a knot of worry tightening in my stomach. The presence of my lute made one thing clear. Any of these objects could be a trap someone had left for me. Vichette had said the test was more than what I brought back from the tree. It was also how I brought it and what I did with it afterward. If I brought out the heavy bar of gold and gave it to Shane, would that show I was willing to bring money back to the school? Or would it signify that I would cling greedily to something heavy and unwieldy despite the fact that it put me in danger? The same was true of any of these things. If I took the red shirt, I could be seen as either nobly striving for the right to wear it, or arrogantly presuming I was good enough to join their ranks. This was obviously true of the ancient sword that hung there. I didn't doubt that it was as precious to the Adem as a child. I made another slow circuit of the tree, pretending to consider my choices, but really just stalling for time. I nervously looked over the items a second time. There was a small book with a brass lock. There was a spindle of gray woolen thread. There was a smooth round stone sitting on a clean white cloth. As I looked at them all, I realized any choice I made could be interpreted so many ways. I didn't know nearly enough about Adem culture to guess what my item might signify. Even if I did, without the name of the wind to guide me back through the canopy, I would be cut to ribbons leaving the tree. Probably not enough to maim me, but enough to make it clear I was a clumsy barbarian who obviously didn't belong. I looked at the gold bar again. If I chose that, at least the weight of it would give me an excuse for being awkward on my way out. Perhaps I could still make a good showing of it. Nervously, I made a third circuit of the tree. I felt the wind pick up, gusting and making the branches flail about more wildly than before. It pulled the sweat from my body, chilling me and making me shiver. In the middle of that anxious moment, I was suddenly aware of nothing as much as the sudden urgent pressure of my bladder. My biology cared nothing for the gravity of my situation, and I was seized with a powerful need to relieve myself. Thus it was that in the center of a storm of knives, in the midst of my test that was also my trial, that I thought of urinating up against the side of the sacred sword tree while 24 proud and deadly mercenaries watched me do it. It was such a horrifying and inappropriate thought that I burst out laughing, and when the laugh rolled out of me, the tension knotting my stomach and clawing at the muscles of my back melted away. Whatever choice I made, it would have to be better than pissing on the Latantha. At that moment, no longer boiling with anger, no longer gripped with fear, I looked at the moving leaves around me. Always before, when the name of the wind had left me, it had faded like a dream on waking, irretrievable as an echo or a fading sigh. But this time it was different. I had spent hours watching the patterns of these moving leaves. I looked out through the branches of the tree and thought of Celian jumping and spinning, laughing and running. And there it was, like the name of an old friend that had simply slipped my mind for a moment. I looked out among the branches and I saw the wind. I spoke the long name of it gently, and the wind grew gentle. I breathed it out as a whisper, and for the first time since I had come to Hert, the wind went quiet and utterly still. In this place of endless wind, it seemed as if the world were suddenly holding its breath. The unceasing dance of the sword tree slowed, then stopped, as if it were resting, as if it had decided to let me go. I stepped away from the tree and began to walk slowly towards Shane, bringing nothing with me. As I walked, I raised my left hand and drew my open palm across the razor edge of a hanging leaf. I came to stand before Shane, stopping the polite distance from her. I stood, my face an impassive mask. I stood, utterly silent, perfectly still. I extended my left hand, bloody palm up, and closed it into a fist. The gesture meant willing. There was more blood than I'd expected, and it pressed between my fingers to run down the back of my hand. After a long moment, Shane nodded. I relaxed, and only then did the wind return. "Louis? What are you doing? Louis! Come here. Come here. Whatever you're doing, stop it." I hear him messing with stuff. You would have taken the gold, like, for yourself. Just been like, see ya. Okay. Okay. Chapter 124. Secrets and Mysteries. "You," Vachette said as we walked through the hills, "are one great, gaudy, showboating bastard, you know that?" I inclined my head slightly to her, gracefully gesturing subordinate acceptance. She cuffed me on the side of the head. "Get over yourself, you melodramatic ass. You can fool them, but not me." Vachette held her hand to her chest as if gossiping. "Did you hear what Quoth brought back from the sword tree? The things a barbarian cannot understand. Silence and stillness. The heart of a Demra. What did he offer to Shane? Willingness to bleed for the school." She looked at me, her expression trapped between disgust and amusement. "Seriously, it's like you stepped out of a storybook." I gestured, gracious, flattering, understated, affectionate acceptance. Vachette reached out and flicked my ear hard with a finger. "Ow!" I burst out laughing. "Fine, but don't you dare accuse me of melodrama. You people are one great unending dramatic gesture. The quiet, the blood-red clothes, the hidden language, secrets and mysteries. Name of the chapter. Whoa. Very loud sound, I don't know what that was. It's like your lives are one giant dumb show." I met her eye. "And I do mean that in all its various clever implications." "Well, you impressed Shane," she said, "which is the most important thing, and you did it in such a way that the heads of the other schools won't be able to grumble too much, which is the other most important thing." We reached our destination, a low building of 3 rooms next to a small split-timber goat pen. "Here is the one who will tend to your hand," she said. "What of the apothecary?" I asked. "The apothecary is close friends with Carceret's mother," Vachette said, "and I would not have her looking after your hands for a weight of gold." She nodded her head at the nearby house. "Daeln, on the other hand, is who I would come to if I needed mending." She knocked on the door. "You may be a member of the school, but do not forget that I am still your teacher. In all things, I know what is best." Later, my hand tightly bandaged, Vachette and I sat with Shane. We were in a room I'd never seen before, smaller than the rooms where we had discussed the Livani. There was a small, messy writing desk, some flowers in a vase, and several comfortably cushioned chairs. Along one wall was a picture of 3 birds in flight against a sunset sky, not painted, but composed of thousands of pieces of bright enameled tile. I suspected we might be in the equivalent of Shane's study. "How is your hand?" Shane said. "Fine," I said. "It is a shallow cut. Daeln has the smallest stitches I've ever seen. He is quite remarkable." She nodded, approval. I held up my left hand, wrapped in clean white linen. "The hard part will be keeping this hand idle for 4 days. I already feel as if it were my tongue that were cut, and not my hand." Shane gave a slight smile at this, startling me. The familiarity of the expression was a great compliment. "You performed quite well today. Everyone is speaking of it." I expect the few that saw have better things to speak about," I said modestly. Amused disbelief. "That may be true, but those who watched from hiding will doubtless say what they have seen. Celine herself will have already told 100 people, unless I miss my guess. By tomorrow everyone will expect your stride to shake the ground as if you were Aeth himself come back to visit us. I couldn't think of anything to say, so I kept quiet. A rarity for me. But as I've said, I had been learning. There is something I have been waiting to speak to you about, Shane said. Guarded curiosity. After Tempe brought you here, he told me the long story of your time together, she said, of your search for the bandits. I nodded. Is it true that you made blood magic to destroy some men, then called lightning to destroy the rest? Bichette looked up at this, glancing back and forth between us. I had grown so used to speaking Oturan with her that it was odd to see the expressionless Adem impassivity covering her face. Still, I could tell she was surprised. She hadn't known. I thought of trying to offer an explanation for my actions, then decided against it. Yes. You are powerful, then. I had never thought of it in those terms before. I have some power. Others are more powerful. Is that why you seek the Catan? To gain power? No, I seek from curiosity. I seek the knowing of things. Knowing is a type of power, Shane pointed out, then seemed to change the subject. Tempe told me there was a Rinta among the bandits as their leader. Rinta? I asked respectfully. A bad thing. A man who was more than a man, yet less than a man. A demon? I asked, using the Oturan word without thinking. Not a demon, Shane said, switching easily to Oturan. There are no such things as demons. Your priests tell stories of demons to frighten you. She met my eye briefly, gesturing at graceful, apologetic honesty and serious import. But there are bad things in the world, old things in the shape of men, and there are a handful worse than all the rest. They walk the world freely and do terrible things. I felt hope rising within me. I have also heard them called the Chandrian, I said. Shane nodded. I have heard this too, but Rinta is a better word. Shane gave me a long look and fell back into Ademic. Given what Tempe has told me of your reaction, I think that you have met such a one before. Yes. Will you meet such a one again? Yes. The certainty in my own voice surprised me. With purpose? Yes. What purpose? To kill him. Such things are not easily killed. I nodded. Will you use what Tempe has taught you to do this? I will use all things to that purpose. I unconsciously began to gesture absolute, but the bandage on my hand stopped me. I frowned at it. That is good, Shane said. Your Catan will not be enough. It is poor for one as old as you are. Good for a barbarian. Good for one with as little training as you have had, but still poor overall. I fought hard to keep the eagerness out of my voice, wishing I could use my hand to indicate how important the question was to me. Shane, I have a great desire to know more of these Rinta. Shane was quiet for a long moment. I will consider this, she said at last, making a gesture I thought might be trepidation. Such things are not spoken of lightly. I kept my face impassive and forced my bandaged hand to say profound, respectful desire. I thank you for considering it, Shane. Anything you could tell me of them I would value more than a weight of gold. Bichette gestured from firm discomfort, then polite desire, difference. 2 span ago I couldn't have understood, but now I realized she wanted to move the conversation onto a different subject. So I bit my tongue and let it go. I knew enough about the Adem by this point to realize that pushing the issue was the worst thing to do if I wanted to learn more. In the Commonwealth, I could have pressed the point, teased and wheedled it out of the person I was talking to. That wouldn't work here. Stillness and silence were the only things that would work. I had to be patient and let Shane return to the subject in her own time. I was saying, Shane continued, reluctant confession, your Catan is poor, but were you to train yourself in proper fashion for a year, you would be Tempe's equal. You flatter me. I do not. I tell you your weaknesses. You learn quickly. That leads to rash behavior, and rashness is not of the Lithani. Bichette is not alone in thinking there is something troubling about your spirit. Shane gave me a long look. For over a minute she stared at me. Then she gave me an eloquent shrug and glanced at Bichette, favoring the younger woman with a ghost of a smile. Still, whimsical musing, if I have ever met someone without a single shadow on their heart, it was surely a child too young for speaking. She pushed herself out of her chair and brushed off her shirt with both hands. Come, let us go and have a name for you. Shane led the 3 of us up the side of a steep, rocky hill. None of us had spoken since we had left the school. I didn't know what was about to happen, but it didn't seem proper to ask. It would have seemed irreverent, like a groom blurting out, "What comes next?" halfway through his own wedding. We came to a grassy ledge with a leaning tree clutching tight to the bare face of a cliff. Beside the tree was a thick wooden door, one of the hidden Adem homes. Shane knocked and opened the door herself. Inside it wasn't cave-like at all. The stone walls were finished, and the floor was smooth wood. It was much larger than I'd expected, too, with a high ceiling and 6 doors leading deeper into the stone of the cliff. A woman sat at a low table, copying something from one book into another. Her hair was white, her face wrinkled as an old apple. It occurred to me that this was the first person I'd seen reading or writing in all my time in Hert. The old woman nodded a greeting at Shane, then turned to Vachette, and her eyes crinkled around the edges. Gladness. "Vachette," she said, "I did not know you returned." "We are come for a name, Magwin," Shane said, polite, formal entreaty. "A name?" Magwin asked, puzzled. She looked from Shane to Vachette, then her eyes moved to where I stood behind them, to my bright red hair and my bandaged hand. "Ah," she said, growing suddenly somber. Magwin closed her books and came to her feet. Her back was bent, and she took small, shuffling steps. She motioned me forward and walked a slow circle around me, looking me carefully up and down. She avoided looking at my face, but took hold of my unbandaged hand, turning it over to look at the palm and the fingertips. "I would hear you say something," she said, still looking intently at my hand. "As you will, honored shaper of names," I said. Magwin looked up at Shane. "Does he mock me?" "I think not." Magwin made another circle of me, running her hands over my shoulders, my arms, the back of my neck. She moved her fingers through my hair, then stopped in front of me and looked me fully in the eye. Her eyes were like Elodin's. Not in any of the details. Elodin's eyes were green, sharp, and mocking. Magwin's were the familiar Adem gray, slightly watery and red around the edges. No, the similarity was in how she looked at me. Elodin was the only other person I had met who could look at you like that, as if you were a book he was idly thumbing through. When Magwin met my eyes for the first time, I felt like all the air had been sucked out of me. For the barest of moments, I thought she might be startled by what she saw, but that was probably just my anxiety. I had come to the edge of disaster too often lately, and despite how well my recent test had gone, part of me was still waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Maigre," she said, her eyes still fixed on mine. She looked down and made her way back to her book. "Maigre?" Vachette said, a hint of dismay in her voice. She might have said more, but Shane reached out and cuffed her sharply on the side of the head. It was exactly the same motion Vachette had used to chastise me 1,000 times in the last month. I couldn't help myself. I laughed. Vachette and Shane glared at me. Actually glared. Magwin turned to look at me. She didn't seem upset. "Do you laugh at the name I have given you?" "Never, Magwin," I said, trying my best to gesture respect with my bandaged hand. "Names are important things." She continued to eye me. "And what would a barbarian know of names?" "Some," I said, fumbling with my bandaged hand again. I couldn't add fine shades of meaning to my words without it. "Far away I have made a study of such things. I know more than many, but still only just a little." Magwin looked at me for a long time. "Then you will know you should not speak of your new name to anyone," she said. "It is a private thing and dangerous to share." I nodded. Magwin looked satisfied at this and settled back onto her chair, opening a book. "Vachette, my little rabbit, you should come and visit me soon." Gentle chiding fondness. "I will, grandmother," Vachette said. "Thank you, Magwin," Shane said, deferential gratitude. The old woman nodded a distracted dismissal, and Shane led us from the cave. True. He told all of us. I don't remember him saying this name in the first book. Oh, okay. Later that evening, I walked back to Vachette's house. She was sitting on the bench out front, watching the sky as the sun began to set. She tapped the bench beside her, and I took a seat. "How does it feel to no longer be a barbarian?" she asked. "Mostly the same," I said. "Slightly drunker." After dinner, Penth had pulled me away to her house, where there was a party of sorts. Call it a gathering, rather, as there was no music or dancing. Still, I was flattered that Penth had gone to the effort of finding 5 other Adem who were willing to celebrate my admittance into the school. I was pleased to learn the Adem impassivity dissolved quite easily after a few drinks, and we were all grinning like barbarians in no time. It relaxed me, especially as much of my own clumsiness with the language could now be blamed on my bandaged hand. "Earlier today," I said carefully, "Shane said she knew a story about the Rinta." Vachette turned to look at me, her face expressionless, hesitant. "I have searched all over the world for such a thing," I said. "There are few things I would value more." Utter sincerity. And I worry that I did a poor job of letting Shane know this. Questioning, intense entreaty. Bichette looked at me for a moment, as if waiting for me to continue. Then she gestured reluctance. I will mention it to her, she said. Reassurance. Finished. I nodded and let the subject drop. Bichette and I sat for a while in companionable silence as the sun slowly sank into the horizon. She drew a deep breath and sighed expansively. I realized that, with the exception of waiting for me to catch my breath or recover from a fall, we had never done anything like this before. Up until this point, every moment we had spent together had been focused on my training. Tonight, I said at last, Penth told me she thought I had a fine anger, and that she'd like to share it with me. Bichette chuckled. That didn't take very long. She gave me a knowing look. What happened? I blushed a bit. She reminded me the Adem do not consider physical contact particularly intimate. Bichette's smile grew practically lecherous. Grabbed a hold of you, did she? Almost, I said. I move more quickly than I did a month ago. I doubt you move quickly enough to keep away from Penth, Bichette said. All she is looking for is sex play. There is no harm in it. That is why I was asking you, I said slowly, to see if there was any harm in it. Bichette raised an eyebrow, at the same time gesturing vague puzzlement. Penth is quite lovely, I said carefully. However, you and I have, I looked for an appropriate term, been intimate. Realization washed over Bichette's face, and she laughed again. What you mean is that we have been sexual. The intimacy between a teacher and student is greater by far than that. Ah, I said, relaxing. I'd suspected something of the sort, but it is nice to know for certain. Bichette shook her head. I had forgotten what it is like with you barbarians, she said, her voice heavy with fond indulgence. It has been so many years since I had to explain such things to my poet king. So you would not be offended if I were to... I made an inarticulate gesture with my bandaged hand. You are young and energetic, she said. It is a healthy thing for you to do. Why would I be offended? Do I suddenly own your sex, that I should be worried about you giving it away? Bichette stopped as if something had just occurred to her. She turned to look at me. Are you offended that I have been having sex with others all this while? She watched my face intently. I see you are startled by it. I am startled, I admitted. Then I did a mental inventory and was surprised to discover I wasn't sure how I felt. I feel I ought to be offended, I said at last, but I don't think I am. Bichette nodded approvingly. That is a good sign. It shows you are becoming civilized. The other feeling is what you were brought up to think. It is like an old shirt that no longer fits you, and now, when you look at it closely, you can see it was ugly to begin with. I hesitated for a moment. Out of curiosity, I said, how many others have you been with since we have been together? Bichette seemed surprised by the question. She pursed her mouth and looked up at the sky for a long moment before shrugging. How many people have I spoken with since then? How many have I sparred with? How many times have I eaten or practiced my katan? Who counts such things? And most Adem think this way? I asked, glad to finally have the chance to ask these questions. That sex is not an intimate thing? Of course it is intimate, Bichette said. Anything that brings two people close together is intimate. A conversation, a kiss, a whisper, even fighting is intimate. But we are not strange about our sex. We do not feel shame about it. We do not feel it important to keep someone else's sex all to ourselves, like a miser hoarding gold. She shook her head. More than any other, this strangeness in your thinking sets you barbarians apart. But what of romance, then? I asked, slightly indignant. What of love? Bichette laughed again, then loud and long and vastly amused. Half of Hert must have heard it, and it echoed back to us from the distant hills. You barbarians, she said, wiping moisture from her eyes. I had forgotten how backward you are. My poet king was the same way. It took him a long, miserable time before he realized the truth of things. There is a great deal of difference between a penis and a heart. Wise words. Okay. Chapter 125. Caesura. The next day I woke somewhat blearily. I hadn't drunk that much, but my body was no longer used to such things, and so I felt each drink 3 times that morning. I straggled to the baths, dunked myself in the hottest pool I could stand, then scrubbed the vaguely gritty feeling away as best as I could. I was heading back to the dining hall when Bichette and Shane found me in the hallway. Bichette gestured for me to follow, and I fell in step behind them. I hardly felt up for training or a formal conversation, but refusing didn't seem like a realistic option. We wound our way through several hallways, eventually emerging near the center of the school. Passing through a courtyard, we approached a small square building that Shane unlocked with a small iron key, the first locked door I had seen in all of Hare. The three of us moved into a small windowless entryway. Bichette closed the outside door, and the room grew black as pitch, cutting off the sound of the persistent wind. Then Shane opened the inner door. Warm light from a half-dozen candles greeted us. At first it seemed odd that they had been left to burn in an empty room. My mouth is not moving fast enough. Then I saw what hung on the walls. Swords gleamed in the candlelight, dozens of them covering the walls. They were all of them naked, their scabbards hanging underneath them. There were no ritual trappings of the sort you might find in a Tellin church. No tapestries or paintings, just the swords themselves. Still, it was obvious that this was an important place. There was a tension in the air of the sort you might feel in the archives or an old graveyard. Shane turned to Bichette. "Choose." Bichette looked startled by this, almost stricken. She started to make a gesture, but Shane held up a hand before she could protest. "He is your student," Shane said. "Refusal. You have brought him into the school. It is your choice." Bichette looked from Shane to me to the dozens of gleaming swords. They were all slender and deadly, each subtly different from the others. Some were curved, some longer or thicker than the others. Some showed signs of much use, while some few resembled Bichette's, with worn hilts and unmarked blades of gray burnished metal. Slowly, Bichette moved to the right-hand wall. She picked up a sword, hefted it, and put it back. Then she lifted a different one, gripped it, and held it out for me. I took hold of it. It was light and thin as a whisper. "Maiden combs her hair," Bichette said. I obeyed, feeling somewhat self-conscious, as Shane was watching. But before I made it halfway through the sweeping movement, Bichette was already shaking her head. She took the sword back from me and returned it to the wall. After another minute, she handed me a second sword. It had worn etching running down the blade like a crawling ivy. At Bichette's request, I made Heron falling. I swept high and lunged low, sword flickering. Bichette raised an eyebrow to me, questioning. I shook my head. "The point is too heavy for me." Bichette didn't seem particularly surprised, and returned that sword to the wall as well. So things continued. Bichette hefted swords and rejected most without a sword. Bichette hefted swords and rejected most without a word. She set 3 more in my hands, asked for various pieces of the khatan, then returned them to the wall without asking my opinion. Bichette moved more slowly as she made her way along the second wall. She handed me a sword slightly curved like Penth's, and my breath caught when I saw the blade was the same flawless, burnished gray as Bichette's. I took it carefully, but the grip wasn't right for my fingers. When I handed it back, I saw relief written plainly on her face. As she progressed along the wall, occasionally Bichette would steal a glance at Shane. At those moments, she looked very little like my confident, swaggering teacher, and very much like a young woman desperately hoping for a word of advice. Shane remained impassive. Eventually, Bichette came to the third wall, moving slower and slower. She handled almost every sword now, taking a long time before setting them back in their places. Then, slowly, she laid her hand on another sword with a blade of burnished gray. She lifted it off the wall, gripped it, and seemed to age 10 years. Bichette avoided looking at Shane and handed me the sword. The guard of this one extended out slightly, curving to give a hint of protection to the hand. It was nothing like a full handguard. Anything that bulky would render half the khatan useless. But it looked as if it would give my fingers an extra bit of shelter, and that was appealing to me. The warm grip settled into my palm as smoothly as the neck of my lute. Before she could ask, I made Maiden combs her hair. It felt like stretching after a long stiff sleep. I eased into 12 stones, and for the smallest of moments I felt graceful as Penth looked when she fought. I made Heron falling, and it was sweet and simple as a kiss. Bichette held out her hand to take it back from me. I didn't want to give it up, but I did. I knew this was the worst possible time and place for me to make a scene. Holding the sword, Bichette turned to Shane. "This is the one for him," she said. And for the first time since I'd known my teacher, it was as if all the laughing had been pressed out of her. Her voice was thin and dry. Shane nodded. "I agree. You have done well to find it." Bichette's relief was palpable, though her face still looked somewhat stricken. "It will perhaps offset his name," she said. She held the sword out to Shane. Shane gestured, refusal. "No. Your student, your choice, your responsibility." Bichette took the scabbard from the wall and sheathed the sword. Then she turned and held it out to me. "This is named Cicera." "Caesura?" I said, startled by the name. Wasn't that what Sim had called the break in the line of Eldvintic verse? Was I being given a poet's sword? Sisera, she said softly, as if it were the name of God. She stepped back, and I felt the weight of it settle back into my hands. Sensing something was expected of me, I drew it from its sheath. The faint ring of leather and metal seemed a whisper of its name. Sisera. It felt light in my hand. The blade was flawless. I slid it back into its sheath, and the sound was different. It sounded like the breaking of a line. It said, Sisera. Shane opened the inner door, and we left as we came, silently and with respect. I wonder if that's the sword that he has hanging up in the inn. The rest of the day was quite the opposite of exciting. With a dogged and humorless persistence, Bichette taught me how to care for my sword, how to clean and oil my sword, how to dismantle and reassemble my sword, how to strap the scabbard to my shoulder or hip, how the slightly enlarged guard would alter a few of the grips and motions of the baton. The sword was not mine. The sword belonged to the school, to a Demra. I would return it when I was no longer able to fight. Well, that answers my question. That's what I was thinking, too. I was actually absolutely thinking of Harry Potter there, and the wands. Okay. While I normally have little tolerance for hearing the same thing over and over again, I let Bichette ramble. The least I could do was let her repeat herself a bit when she was plainly anxious and trying to settle her mind. Around the 15th repetition, I asked what I should do if the sword broke. Not the hilt or the guard, but the blade itself. Should I still bring it back? Bichette gave me a look of dismay, so raw it verged on horror. She didn't answer, and I made a point of not asking any more questions for the rest of the morning. After lunch, Bichette took me back to Magwin's cave. My teacher's mood seemed somewhat improved, but she was still far from her regular gregarious self. Magwin will be giving you Sisera's story, she said. You must memorize it. Its story? I asked. Bichette shrugged. In Ademic, it's Atas. It is the history of your sword. Everyone who has carried it, what they have done. It is something you must know. We reached the top of the path and stood before Magwin's door. Bichette gave me a serious look. You must be on your best behavior and be very polite. I will, I said. Magwin is an important person, and you must attend closely to what she says. I will, I said. Bichette knocked on the door and escorted me in. Magwin sat at the same table as before. For all I could tell, she was copying the same book. She smiled when she saw Bichette, then noticed me and let her face slide into the familiar Adem impassivity. Magwin, Bichette said, profoundly polite entreaty. This one needs the Atas of his sword. Which sword did you find for him? Magwin asked, her face wrinkling even further as she squinted to see. Sisera, Bichette said. Magwin gave a laugh that was almost a cackle. She got down off her chair. I can't say I'm surprised, she said, and disappeared through a door that led back into the cliff. Bichette let herself out, and I stood there feeling awkward, like one of those terrible dreams where you're on stage and can't remember what to say, or even what part you were meaning to play. Magwin returned, carrying a thick book bound in brown leather. At a gesture from her, we took seats in chairs facing each other. Hers was a deeply cushioned leather chair. Mine was not. I sat with Sisera across my knees, partly because it seemed appropriate, and partly because I was fond of the feel of it beneath my hand. She opened the book, the binding crackling as she spread it open on her lap. She flipped pages for a moment until she found the place she was looking for. First came Shale, she read, who shaped me in fire for an unknown purpose. He carried me, then cast me aside. Magwin looked up, unable to gesture as her hands were both occupied by the large book. Well? She demanded. What would you like me to do? I asked politely. I couldn't gesture due to my bandages. We made a fine pair of half-mutes. Repeat it back, she said, irritated. You need to learn them all. First came Chael, I said, who shaped me in fire for an unknown purpose. He carried me, then cast me aside. She nodded and continued. Next came Etain. I repeated it. We continued this way for perhaps half an hour. Owner after owner, name after name, loyalties declaimed and enemies killed. At first the names and places were tantalizing. Then, as it continued, the list began to depress me, as nearly each piece ended with the death of the owner. They were not peaceful deaths, either. Some died in wars, some in duels. Many were merely killed by or slain by, giving no clue as to their circumstances. After 30 of these, I had heard nothing resembling passed from this world peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by fat grandchildren. Then the list stopped being depressing and became simply boring instead. Next came Fenole of the clear and shining eye, I repeated attentively, much beloved of Dulcin. She herself slew 2 Daruna. That's very close to Darunia. That made me think of Zelda. Threw me off. She herself slew 2 Daruna, then was killed by Gremin at the Drossen Tor. I cleared my throat before Magwyn could recite another passage. If I may ask, I said, how many have carried Caesura over the years? Caesara, she corrected me sharply. Do not presume to meddle with her name. It means to break, to catch, and to fly. I looked down at the sheathed sword across my lap. I felt the weight of it, the chill of the metal under my fingers. A small sliver of the smooth gray blade was visible above the top of the sheath. How can I say this so you can understand? Caesara was a fine name. It was thin and bright and dangerous. It fit the sword like a glove fits a hand. But it wasn't the perfect name. This sword's name was Caesura. This sword was the jarring break in a line of perfect verse. It was the broken breath. It was smooth and swift and sharp and deadly. The name didn't fit like a glove, it fit like skin. More than that, it was bone and muscle and movement. Those things are the hand. And Caesura was the sword. It was both the name and the thing itself. I can't tell you how I knew this, but I knew it. Besides, if I was to be a namer, I decided I could damn well choose the name of my own sword. I looked up at Magwyn. It is a good name, I agreed politely, deciding to keep my opinion to myself until I was well gone from Ademra. I am only wondering how many owners there have been entirely. That is something I should know as well. Magwyn gave me a sour look that said she knew I was patronizing her, but she flipped ahead several pages in her book, then a few more, then a few more. 236, she said. You will be the 237th. She flipped back to the beginning of the list. Let us begin again. She drew a breath and said, First came Chael, who shaped me in fire for an unknown purpose. He carried me, then cast me aside. I fought down the urge to sigh. Even with my trooper's knack for learning lines, it would take long, weary days setting them all to memory. Then I realized what this truly meant. If each owner had kept Caesura for 10 years, it had never sat idle for longer than a day or two. And it had never sat idle for longer than a day or two. It meant that Caesura was, at a very conservative estimate, more than 2,000 years old. I received my next surprise 3 hours later when I tried to excuse myself for supper. As I stood to leave, there was no comma, so I didn't pause. As I stood to leave, Magwyn explained I was to remain with her until I learned all of Caesura's story by heart. Someone would bring us our meals, and there was a room nearby where I could sleep. First came Chael. What time is it? Well, it's 7:54. Yeah, I'm going to stop there. And we will continue this whenever the next day is that we're all available. The owner stories, yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I like that. All right, well, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on here next time.